Thanks so much for joining me. My name is Erin Harner, gut health, IBS, and SIBO coach and dietitian. And I want to jump into some questions that I received from my community all about gluten, FODMAPs, leaky gut, you name it. We're going to get into it. So stick around and let's go. First question. I feel better when I avoid gluten, but my celiac test was negative. What's going on? Okay, lots of potential things going on. So let's break down this question. I feel better when I avoid gluten, but had a negative celiac test. So there's this thing called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And yes, it's a real thing. Not all gluten challenges are actually related to celiac disease. Celiac disease, I would say, is probably one of the most severe, and only about 1% of the population actually has celiac disease, about 1 in 100. So the challenge is that the symptoms of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or NCGS, can actually mimic celiac disease, and it's a little tricky to tell what the difference is sometimes. So if you were ruled out for celiac disease, it doesn't necessarily mean that gluten is fair game. You could have something like non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And it's been shown in the research that approximately 6 to 10% of the population actually have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is a lot more than celiac disease, which is about 1 in 100 or 1%. Dr. Alessio Fasano at Harvard actually did a lot of research on non-celiac gluten sensitivity and has published lots of really great papers around what happens in non-celiac gluten sensitivity. We used to think that there was no immune system involvement, but now we know that there's actually real intestinal inflammation that occurs, and the symptoms can be identical to IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. So it can be very confusing to know what the problem is. Is it celiac? Is it non-celiac gluten sensitivity? Is it a wheat allergy? Is it a fructan problem? So let's break some of those things down because it can be very, very confusing. The thing about celiac disease is how you treat it. Let me just back up for a second. So celiac disease, you have these villi in your intestines. And when those villi over time get damaged and inflamed and smushed and flattened, that's when we diagnose celiac disease. And in order for a blood test for celiac to show up positive, your intestinal villi have to be pretty well damaged in order for it to even show up. So that's something to keep in mind. I often see negatives for years before we see a positive on a blood test. The gold standard is really an intestinal biopsy via endoscopy. So they'll put a scope down your throat, they'll go into your small intestine, they'll look at the first part of the small intestine only and determine if the villi are flattened, and they'll figure that out via biopsy, basically taking a piece of tissue and looking at it under a microscope. So if you have a negative celiac test, it doesn't mean that gluten is fair game. So let's dig into this a little bit more. So there is a testing trap. So sometimes I'll see clients who have gone gluten-free and they got tested for celiac disease. And I'll ask, what kind of test did you do? Did you do a genetic test or did you do an antibody test? So in order for an antibody test, like tissue transglutaminase or TTG-IgA, in order for that to be positive, you actually have to be eating gluten. So you have to be eating gluten for at least 6 to 8 weeks, the equivalent of roughly like 1 to 2 pieces of bread a day, wheat bread, in order for the test to be positive. So if you've gone gluten-free or you're eating a very small amount of gluten, the likelihood of that test showing up is very low. There could be a false negative. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are already gluten-free and you want to be tested for celiac disease, what you would want to do is actually a genetic test, not an antibody test, unless you want to do a gluten challenge and go back on gluten to get tested. Which is why the important takeaway here is I always recommend, if you're having symptoms in your gut that look like they could be related to celiac disease, you always want to get tested before you remove the gluten from your diet whenever possible. So don't remove the gluten until you test for celiac. If we can rule out celiac disease and maybe it's gluten sensitivity, it doesn't mean it's a fair pass, but the level of gluten-free that you need to be if you are diagnosed with celiac disease is very, very strict. No gluten for the rest of your life. That is the only treatment for celiac disease at this point. So it's really, really important to get tested. If you've already removed the gluten, HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8 genes can be tested for. The cool thing about genetics is they don't change. We can turn on and turn off our genes with a number of factors, but the genetics are fixed in our body. So that's not going to change. You only need to do it once, and it's very common, very easy to do by your traditional healthcare provider. So when we're thinking about the answer to this question, I feel better when I avoid gluten, but my celiac test was negative. You might not have celiac disease. If you haven't done a genetic test would be another way to potentially rule out celiac disease. At least 95% of people who have celiac disease have a genetic predisposition, which means they have positive HLA-DQ2 and/or DQ8 genetics. If you don't have those genetics, it's possible that you could have gluten sensitivity, but not celiac disease. So that's something to keep in mind. You can still test something even if you're not eating gluten. If you've already removed gluten, you want to think about, okay, what else is going on here? This is where we can get a little confused with the difference between fructans and gluten. So gluten is basically a protein, okay? It's just a protein. It's found in wheat and barley and rye, and there's a lot of different glutens or glutenins or gliadins, and you'll hear all of these words, and it can get very confusing. We think about gluten, we think about gliadin, we think about glutenins. What we need to know here is that the body is reacting to the proteins in the wheat, barley, or rye grains. That's traditionally what we consider gluten or gliadin. When we're thinking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, the reactions are to those same proteins. It's a protein issue. When we're thinking about reacting to the carbohydrates in the food, we're thinking about fructans. That would be a FODMAP issue. Now, the difference between gluten and FODMAPs is that when we're reacting to FODMAPs, the FODMAPs are a carbohydrate or a sugar, and the gluten is a protein. They are not the same. And there's been really nice research that shows that a lot of people who are avoiding gluten are actually reactive to the carbohydrates or the FODMAPs and not the gluten. So it's really important to dig a little deeper and to tease out what the differences are. What I do in my practice when I work with clients is I do some stool testing. And if someone's on a gluten-free diet, I might look at like gluten peptide in their stool to see if there was exposure to gluten. Or in the standard test, there's anti-gliadin IgA, which means that what is the gut reaction to gluten? And it can give us some information that would help us understand, is gluten a problem at this point in time or not? So that's something to keep in mind. All right, next question. My doctor says my bloating and stomach pain is just IBS, but could it actually be celiac disease? Question. I'm not a diagnostician. I cannot diagnose celiac disease. I cannot diagnose IBS. So I'm going to put that out there first and foremost. These are great questions to go and ask your doctor. I want to just share some statistics that are pretty wild, if you ask me. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis when it comes to celiac disease. So the average time for a celiac diagnosis is typically 6 to 10 years. And about 83% of people with celiac disease are actually undiagnosed or they're misdiagnosed as something else. So if you're concerned about celiac, go to your doctor and ask for a test. It is very simple. And if the tests are negative, then we can move on to something else, another scenario. There's also an overlap with irritable bowel syndrome or IBS. So up to about 10% of people diagnosed with IBS actually have celiac disease. And this is Dr. Peter Green's research. So 1 in 10 people who are diagnosed as IBS might actually have celiac disease. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you're having a lot of gut symptoms, having a lot of IBS symptoms, it might be a good idea to get tested for celiac. Either the antibody test or the genetic test or both. Some red flag symptoms that I look for when we're thinking about, what's going on here? Could it actually be celiac disease? There's a few things to really keep in mind. Iron deficiency is one I see all the time. Persistent low vitamin D. Persistent low B12. These are nutrients that need to be absorbed through the gut barrier. If the villi are super smushed and damaged, the absorption doesn't happen in the same way. We call this malabsorption. You might be eating enough of the food, but it's not getting into your body. So persistent iron deficiency, persistent low vitamin D or B12 can definitely be red flags that tip me off to wonder what's going on here. And in the course of my 15 plus years of doing this work, I've helped at least 10 clients get diagnosed with celiac disease by sending them to their doctor when I had suspicions of some of these red flag symptoms. Some of the others are unexplained weight loss. Like all of a sudden, everything was fine, you didn't change anything, and you're losing significant amounts of weight, often related to malabsorption as well. Sometimes accompanied by diarrhea, but not always. Keep in mind the symptoms of celiac disease are different in adults and children. Oftentimes we think about children, lots of diarrhea, losing a lot of weight, becoming very frail and scrawny, and we're like, what's going on here? Adults, you could have constipation. You could have IBS symptoms. You could have some stomach pain occasionally or some nausea, right? There could be very different symptoms with adults and children. Chronic fatigue is another one. Early diagnosis of osteoporosis. This is one of the ones that tips me off. If you get diagnosed with osteoporosis before age 50, if you're eating enough of the food, if you're getting enough calcium and magnesium and vitamin D and the other nutrients that are essential for bone health, what's going on there? Could this play a role? Could this be a factor? Another one is unexplained miscarriages or infertility. If there is no other reason for miscarriages or infertility, it would be a good time to get tested for celiac disease or to ask your doctor, could this be a factor, and to test you for celiac. Roughly 2 to 7% of people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune condition, also have celiac disease, compared to only about 1% of the general population. So people with autoimmune diseases like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune form of diabetes, what's going on here with gluten of all things, right? Doesn't seem like it's related, but it can certainly be related. And I want to just share that the iceberg effect definitely applies here. So for every person who has diagnosed celiac disease, there's at least 5 to 7 cases hidden beneath the surface. And it's really tricky because the class of presentation in kids is not the same as adults. So oftentimes when we're thinking celiac, we're thinking, oh, this must be some like really horrible condition, but it might just manifest as some gas or some bloating. It's always worthwhile getting checked out. So if you've been told it's just IBS and something feels off, don't be afraid to ask your doctor for further testing. Usually they start with a TTG, anti-TTG testing, which is antibody testing, or they will do genetic testing for the HLA-DQ2 and DQ8. So that's certainly an option. There are options. You never want to feel like you're trying something, and you don't know what to do. There's always answers. There's always more room to dig. And it's helpful to have somebody on your team who is a digger, who can understand the whole body as a system and spot these red flags if you're not familiar with them. All right, next question. I tried going gluten-free, but I'm still having symptoms. Did I do something wrong? Yes, this is pretty common. Tried going gluten-free, but still having symptoms. Okay, first of all, are you actually gluten-free? And I know that's a hard pill to swallow, like, are you actually gluten-free? But I'm asking you, if you tried going gluten-free and you're still having symptoms, are you actually gluten-free? There's actually a very steep learning curve when it comes to gluten-free eating. It is not as simple as just swapping out your regular bread with gluten-free bread. It is not that simple. So we need to understand, are you actually gluten-free first and foremost? And what I do for my clients is I'll actually review their food records. You know, they'll tell me they're gluten-free and I'll be like, that's interesting. You're having soy sauce on your stir fry. Is it gluten-free soy sauce? Or is it tamari? What kind of soy sauce? So we'll dig into the nuances. We'll dig into the details. There's a lot of potential for cross-contamination in your kitchen, in your toaster, in your salad dressings, and your sauces, and your seasonings, and your soy sauce, for example. Also, there can be cross-contamination in supplements or gluten used in supplements or used in medications. So it's really important to first and foremost, ask the question, are you actually gluten-free? And if the answer is yes, what next? Okay. The next thing to think about is the healing timeline. So gluten-free diet doesn't like miraculously work overnight. If someone was diagnosed with celiac disease, they have pretty significant intestinal villi damage. And it can take 6 months to 2 years, depending on the extent of damage, to fully heal the gut in celiac disease. Remember all those intestinal villi? They're squished. In order to help them rebuild and heal, it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So even if you go on a gluten-free diet, it might take 6 months to 2 years to feel significantly better. Usually it doesn't take that long, but sometimes it does. Also, it's not just gluten. There's other factors that can contribute to the symptoms you're experiencing. Are there cross-reactivity with dairy or corn, or oats, or some other food like soy, eggs, right? There's a lot of different cross-reactive foods if you are indeed gluten-free. About 30% of people with celiac disease, shown in the research, can be cross-reactive to other foods. So basically, these foods don't have gluten in them, but they have similar proteins, and sometimes the immune system gets a little confused, and it treats them like gluten and makes similar symptoms. I see this most common with the protein in dairy, which is called casein. Next up, there's some confusion between FODMAPs and gluten, and I mentioned this before. So if you're going gluten-free, what that means is that you're eliminating wheat, barley, and rye. And these are all high in FODMAP. And you might feel better initially, but the other thing that is very high in fructans, that same category that wheat, barley, and rye fall into, are things like garlic and onions and artichoke and asparagus, very common in the springtime. There are other foods in that same category. And if you're sensitive to one of those or one group of those foods in that category, you're often sensitive to all of the foods in that category. So it's really helpful to understand what's going on in the big picture of your diet and your gut and your symptoms, and really zoom out and not be quite so focused on gluten, but ask the question, what else is going on? So when I do stool testing with clients, I actually look at the anti-gliadin IgA, and this will give us a clue as well. Like, is the gut reacting to gluten? What's going on there? How gluten-free is your gluten-free diet? So if someone is on a gluten-free diet and I do a stool test, I'll often run the gluten peptide. Because if gluten peptide is showing up in your stool, it means that you consumed it in your diet. Not as a slap on the wrist or, you're not following the gluten-free diet to a T, but we need to further investigate what's going on. So it's really helpful to assess for exposure, for cross-contamination. If you're eating out in restaurants a lot, sometimes the restaurants are not very gluten-free, and a lot of packaged foods, they might say they're gluten-free and they're not technically below the limit for gluten-free foods. And that happens more often than you might think. So it's really common actually to go gluten-free and to still have symptoms. But the key is, don't stop there. Don't say, oh no, the gluten-free diet didn't work. We have to dig a little deeper and understand what's going on. There might be other factors that are contributing to how you feel. You don't have to figure this out alone, right? It's pretty complicated. I've been doing this for like 16 plus years. I spent several years on the board of a celiac disease organization. We have to really understand what's going on. We have to be up on the research. We have to know the nuances and the red flags so that we can dig deeper. That confusion that you're feeling, it's not because you're not smart enough. It's not because you're not trying hard enough. It's because gut health is genuinely super complicated. Super, super complicated. And you need someone who understands all the pieces of the puzzle, not just like one piece here and there. If you're ready to get started, I want you to download the Say Goodbye to Gas and Bloating guide in 5 simple steps. This will help give you the next steps to get started on your gluten journey, whether that's understanding what's going on with gluten or understanding what's going on with the gas and bloating and symptoms that you're experiencing in your gut. Go ahead and click the link below, and I'll see you in late inside.